Hello, Fear Seekers, and welcome back to the channel. There's nothing that can quite produce the feeling of solitude like time spent in the desert. Aside from the occasional cactus or wildlife, it really can feel like you're the only one out there, until that feeling evaporates. Today, we're going to be diving into some disturbing, allegedly true, desert horror stories. Now, it is a dream of mine to read subscriber horror stories someday. With that in mind, I'd ask that you subscribe to the channel and like the video so we can make that happen together. If you have a scary story you'd like to hear on this channel, consider sharing it at the official Fermented Fears subreddit, link in the description. Now without further ado, sit back and relax. What you thought you saw was just a mirage. And get ready to ferment your fears. Back around 1992, I was in high school. At that time, I was a sophomore, and unlike most of my friends in school, I didn't work the typical high school jobs like McDonald's, Taco Bell, some retail job in the mall, or work at the local grocery store. I was very good with my hands and worked jobs like construction, demolition, flooring, and auto mechanics. All of my contacts I worked under the table for, as I started working on some of these jobs at 14. It was beneficial for both of us, as I was only called in when needed, and I was the guy willing to only work evenings and weekends. One of my contacts worked doing remodeling projects like at restaurants, bars, retail shops, and typical commercial projects that we could only work after hours. Like I said, that worked out for both of us because I went to school and would sometimes work after school or weekends. For this one contact, it wasn't uncommon for him to leave me alone at a site and have a list of things for me to do alone, mostly demolition work. I did this while the other crew was doing the installation or remodeling work. I was the kid, but had the respect because I did what I was supposed to do and did the work of a man without complaints. I got paid good, and in one night I could make more than my friends did working all week at McDonald's. This one instance, I got a call from the guy I worked for, and he said he had a project for me, and if I could work the following Saturday. I said yeah, sure. He said be sure to bring food and lots to drink, as there was nothing nearby. I used to have a small cooler and would fill it with drinks like Cokes, Gatorade, or whatever, plus chips and a couple sandwiches. Back then, I could eat a whole pizza by myself and burn it all off. He picked me up that Saturday morning as I didn't have a car or license yet, so he would pick me up and drive me to sites for work and leave me alone there. I rarely worked with his other crews as they were the more skilled labor guys. I was just the tear-out kid. Here's the part that was my major downfall to this story. I didn't pay attention to where we were going. I was too busy talking to him, and I think we were talking about cars. You see, at the time, my goal was to save up enough money to buy an old muscle car and rebuild it. It took a long time to arrive to the site. As we drove up, it was in the middle of nowhere. Now, you may not think California has places like this, but back in the early 1990s, out in the Mojave Desert, yes. It was big plots of land and homes more than a few city blocks apart. I knew we left the highway and went down a few other two-lane highways for a long distance. I remember he asked me about my drinks, and he pulled out a brand new jug of water that he had in his truck that looked like it had been there for a while, and told me to take it with me just in case. He said that the water to the house I would be working at was off. As we pull up to the property, he is in a hurry to drop off tools and get to another work site, so I hurry up and help him with things like breaker bars, shovels, pry bars, hammer, broom, several big trash bins, and a small tool bag that I often had with me. He tells me that he will be back to pick me up at about 5 to 6 p.m. as there is no electricity to this site either, plus it should only take me till then to do what I needed to do. That was always his way of saying, I am only paying you till this time, so you better get everything done by then. It was never too outrageous, and we always had a good understanding on time and tasks. He drove away, and I'm at this property all alone. I walk into the house, it's mostly empty. My job was to remove all remaining furniture, contents, and appliances. Remove all the flooring, gut the kitchen and bathrooms, and remove all the wood paneling. This project was going to be like what we now call a flip. They were going to fix it up and sell it. Almost immediately I get kinda spooked by the place. It was very odd. Now mind you, I am used to being on sites alone, working all night. This was the daytime on a Saturday and bright outside. However, the house was old, dark, musty, and kind of cool inside. The kind of cool that gives you goosebumps. To add to the spook factor of the house, let me describe what I remember about it. Imagine walking back in time to the 1960s or earlier. Dark green carpet that looked like matted down broccoli. Pine wood everywhere that had a darker stain to it. The wood paneling wasn't the kind used in the 1980s sheet paneling, but actual board paneling tonged and grooved. Old window curtains that all looked like someone's grandma made them. Avocado green sink, stovetop, oven, and the stuff that was left behind like old furniture and a closet full of old stuffed animals that looked to be about 30 years old. The style of this house was like an old western ranch, as there were wagon wheels inside and outside the house. I had an old battery-powered radio, but only could get a few stations. I was just happy for the noise. I started removing all the junk from the house, and as I normally did on a project if there wasn't a dumpster on site, I made a trash pile. I tore up all the flooring next. To my delight, everything seemed to come up with ease, and it was rip, cut, and toss. I took a big demo hammer to the kitchen and tore it apart in less than an hour. I ended up using that big jug of water that my boss had given me to wash my hands and face periodically. But by late afternoon, as most who know the desert, the dryness also starts to take moisture from you, especially if you are working in it. So by late afternoon, I am down to my last drink, and I had already eaten everything I had brought. No worries, I thought. The guys should be here in a couple hours to pick me up. As the time gets closer for them to arrive, I am finished up with my tasks. I even swept the entire place, and it's now ready for the rehab crew to get to work, making this place look modern. The time of year I was out here, it wasn't a typical hot desert day, but you know in the desert, as soon as the sun goes down, it starts to cool rapidly. I had a flannel shirt, but that wasn't enough, and it was starting to get dark. This was a time before cell phones were common, and, well, there was no electricity, water, or phone service to the house. I climbed up to get on top of the roof of the house to get a better look, to see if I can see something in the distance. And what looked like miles down, I saw a smaller road that this dirt road led to, with a few homes, but those homes were all in dark. My first thought was to hike down to a neighbor's house and ask them to use the phone. The nearest house, no one was home, and this home also looked abandoned. If you remember, the early 90s was the start of a decline of the economy and recession, so it wasn't uncommon for a lot of foreclosed homes in a tract of homes. A lot of those I worked on at that time. I started to think about my options as darkness fast approached. One was to stay at the house until morning. 2, hike with what little water I had a few miles in the dark Mojave night. 3, wait until early morning and hike out of there to some sort of civilization. It also suddenly occurred to me that no one knew where I was except my boss. I don't know if he told anyone else where I was, and certainly my family wouldn't miss me until maybe Sunday night. But I didn't even tell them I was going to work there. They knew me and how much I would work to save up for my car, so they were never worried about me not coming home. As full darkness was all around me, it was amazing looking out at the night sky, and lucky for me the moon was bright. I didn't have a flashlight or any way to make a fire. Even though I tried, I was going to make a small bonfire out of broken up construction debris as the temperature started to fall, probably down to the low 40s. My only option was to go back inside the empty, creepy house that somehow seemed even more creepy sitting alone in the dark. At about 8 p.m., the batteries on my radio, which was my only source of little light and noise, started to die. I grabbed an old wooden chair and sat in the living room of this house facing the door. I am starting to hear wind, odd noises which I assume are animals in the distance, and what sounds like leaves cracking under feet. I am starting to shiver from the cold, so I set off on trying to start a fire in the fireplace, imagining I'm like Tom Hanks in Castaway trying to start a fire. At least this is keeping my mind off my situation. Sitting in this living room next to the fireplace, the house seems even darker than it should have. Mind you, in the daytime, the inside seemed dark, so with only the moonlight, I was pretty much sitting in complete darkness. My mind starts to play tricks on me. I am seeing shadows moving outside and inside the house. I am also starting to hear someone talking, like whispers or something. I get up from my chair and yell out, "Hello?" And just as I do, I hear something fall off from the other side of the house. I run over to the door and go outside again. At least in the moonlight I can see better, but off in the distance I hear noises and see movement, but can't quite make out what it is. I have my pile of tools by the edge of the house ready for when my boss picks me up, so I run over there and grab Big Daddy. It was my heavy pry bar that I used in demo. I was ready to defend myself from whoever or whatever was out there. I have to keep moving because my undershirt and flannel wasn't enough to keep me warm. The wind was also starting to pick up, and for as far as I could see, there were no lights around me. I didn't want to try to make it up on the house again out of fear of falling in the dark, but I got up on top of the gate, just to try and gain a little bit of altitude to see if I could see some house or maybe even nearby car lights. My mind went to the stories that circled around at the time about how people would come up to the Mojave Desert and bury bodies, how there were Satanist groups out here, and how people would go missing for no reason at all. Every noise had me on edge, and every shadow had my heart pounding. Now, I knew no one was in that house, but I swear I would hear noises from inside. I huddled up on the front porch, looking in the living room window, expecting to see someone at any moment. By around 11 p.m., I look at my watch, thinking this is going to be a long night, as all this stuff started once it got dark. I didn't know how I was going to make it another 6 hours till daybreak. I start thinking the moment it gets to be daybreak, the moment light starts to appear on the horizon, I am going to take the little water I had left and walk east. I knew going east I would eventually make it somewhere. I knew that if I followed that direction on the dirt road I was off of, it led to a paved road. Closer to midnight, I am wide awake, my eyes fixed on the dirt road, thinking that any time now a car would come down it and maybe they can call for help for me. I remember casually turning to look back into the house as all this time I kept hearing noises, but kept telling myself maybe a rat or some animal. I see a shadow of a person move from the kitchen down the hall. I jumped up from sitting down, thinking, that is not an animal, that is a human. I start backing my way off of the porch towards the pile and trip over debris, falling on the ground. I get up, but fall again. It was like something pushed me down, or maybe just my imagination. But all of a sudden these bright lights are coming closer to me as I am laying on the ground. I jump up, and it's my boss. He is looking at me like, what the heck are you doing? I was just so glad to see him, I wasn't mad or anything, just asked him what happened. He said that he was sorry, but he thought the other crew was coming to get me, and they thought he was coming. So no one actually came. He said it wasn't until later in the evening he asked the other crew leader about how far along I got that he said I didn't go get him. Well, it took him almost 2 hours from where they were working to come get me. He felt really bad and told me he was going to pay me for the entire time I was out there. He also grabbed a can of Coke from his cooler and asked me if I was thirsty, and I drank that all in one gulp. Once we got back towards civilization, he went through a fast food drive, and I ate like I had never eaten before. As he was driving me home, I asked him about the house. I told him how creepy it was, and he said he didn't have any information on the house. Only what we were supposed to do. After that, I made sure to always keep extra batteries, flashlights, and doubled the amount of liquid. Back in the 80s, my Aunt Kay was in her early 20s. This was before she married my uncle, and when she would drive long distances back and forth between her parents and my uncle's to visit. It was a transitional period for them. He had just graduated and she hadn't moved out yet to be with him. It was a long drive across several states, through the desert, which took her hours. This desolate highway would have stretches of road that lasted hundreds of miles where you quite often wouldn't see another driver, let alone a gas station. So Aunt Kay set out and began one of these journeys. A couple hours into the drive, Aunt Kay noticed a dark vehicle slowly catching up to her. She barely noticed as she continued to sing along to Les Miserables, until the vehicle got aggressively close. She turned off the music and looked into her rearview mirror, seeing the vehicle flash its brights and a hand pointing at her car and motioning to pull over. Alarmed, she quickly slowed and began to look for a good place to pull off the road to see what must be wrong with her car. The second she began to pull off the road, she said she felt and heard as clear as day, "Don't pull over." Then again, stronger, "Don't pull over." Call it God, intuition, or just a gut feeling, but a jolt of adrenaline and fear shot through Aunt Kay's body as she hit the gas and peeled back out onto the highway. Heart pumping, Aunt Kay silently asked herself what the hell was that as she saw the vehicle peel out behind her. The dark vehicle continued to closely follow, flashed their brights, and motioned for her to pull over. Fear and confusion set in as Aunt Kay began to question what was going on. Why was the driver motioning for her to pull over? Was there something wrong with her car? And what the hell was that warning she felt? It would have been a severe situation if her car broke down out there, especially before cell phones, but she pressed on. Just as her resolve wavered, she started questioning if she truly did feel what she felt. She started slowing back down when the dark vehicle picked up speed. It entered into the oncoming traffic lane and came level to my aunt's car. The driver smiled, pointed, motioned, and mouthed the words, "Pull over," to my aunt. She said the second she looked into his eyes, she felt pure evil. She felt a horribly sick feeling in the pit of her stomach and again heard the words in her head, "Don't pull over." She described him as looking scary, greasy, and noticed he was missing a couple teeth in his smile that she'll never forget. That sent chills through her. This quickly dispelled any thought she had of pulling over, and she put the pedal to the metal to try to lose him. He chased after her. She slowed down, he slowed down. She sped up, he sped up. It got to the point that he began to try to push her car off the road. Aunt Kay was to the point of tears as this creep continued to terrorize her alone, out in the middle of nowhere. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Aunt Kay sees a couple of semis off in the distance. She felt if only she could get close or even get in between those trucks, she would be safe, so she took off. He continued to flash his lights, honk his horn, and try to hit her car until she got close enough to the trucks. As she got in between them, she saw the dark vehicle slow way down and eventually disappear from view. She stayed with the trucks for a couple hours until she felt safe enough to pull over at a gas station and cry. Fast forward several years. My aunt and uncle are married. He's working at a law firm as a high-profile criminal prosecutor in Las Vegas. She's now a full-time mom of several young children. Since I've known my aunt, she's been obsessed with true crime. Dateline, 2020, and Unsolved Mysteries were always playing at their house. This day was no different. She was folding laundry in the kitchen while listening to the TV in the other room. The interviewer was talking about a man who was being interviewed on death row. As she paired another match of socks, she heard the man describe one of his tactics for procuring victims. According to him, he would wait along the side of the highway. A car would go by with a family, and he'd wait. Another car with a male driver would go by, and he'd wait. But every so often, a car would go by with a pretty woman driving alone. So I'd pull out behind and follow him. I'd flash my brights, honk and motion for him to pull over. Aunt Kay, paralyzed, continued to listen. When they would eventually pull over, I'd tell them to pop the hood and I'd be able to tell them what was wrong with their car. They would, and I'd yank a couple wires. When the car wouldn't start, I'd tell them no problem. My buddy has a shop in the next town. I'll give you a ride and he'll give you a fair deal. My aunt slowly moved to the living room. They'd get in and I'd assault and kill them. Bury them anywhere in the desert. When asked how many times he did this, he responded, "They'll never find all the bodies. I can't even count." And how many got away? 2 or 3. My aunt stood alone, staring into the same toothless grin she saw on that highway that day. It was Henry Lee Lucas. This seems like the right place for this one. I was 15 living in the Mojave Desert in Southern California during the 90s. Lots of wide open space and not many people. One weekend, my dad and I take out our dirt bikes via trailer to the outskirts of a very small town called Barstow. It's midsummer, so not a lot of people are out riding, which is typically common sight. The heat may have had something to do with it. After unloading the bikes, we decide to trek for a few hours, keeping track of landmarks and marking trails with red cloth under rocks to find our way back. After some time of riding and refuel breaks, we crest a hill and see a dilapidated cabin. There are many lone buildings in the Mojave, but rarely are they cabins. This place just felt odd right off the bat. So, being the intelligent people we were, we decided to check it out. We opened the unlocked front door while its knob barely hung on. It's a single room no bigger than a studio apartment. But it's obvious people have been staying here. There were candy wrappers and beer cans everywhere with recent dates. A lone bucket outside reeked of heat-cooked human leavings. There was no furniture but a single wall-mounted bench and a fireplace. The ceiling had lots of people carving names, messages, and the typical hearts with a date and 2 people's names. I decided to sit on the bench. When I sat, I tucked my feet under the bench and put my toes on their tips on the floor. When I did this, I felt the floor move. I look at the floor, which is not attached to the rest of the rotted wood floor, and remove the cutout piece. It's about a 2-foot square. I called for my dad, and he looks at the hole with the flashlight from his bike. It goes down about 7 feet and back far enough for us not to see the end. This is when my dad shows his parental colors. He looks at me and says, "Well, I'm too fat to check it out. You gonna see what's down there?" I took this as a challenge, so I climbed down. It was a hallway carved out of the desert bedrock that went back about 15 feet. I walk along until it opens up into a larger circular room. The room is empty, but pretty big. I walk around and stub my toe. Look down and see a metal rod fixed into the bedrock with a thick chain end welded on. I look at the walls. The walls. They had freaking scratch marks from fingernails. Lots of them. The more I looked, the more I saw that there are bits of fingernails in the rock. My eyes began to water and my heart began to race. I am legit freaking out. I spider monkey right out of the entrance and tell Dad everything while trying not to cry. He looks worried. We get on the bikes and get into high gear. Following those red rags we left as landmarks was the most stressful time I can remember having. We get to the truck, load up, and book it home. Dad hid the truck in the garage for a few days after that to be sure no one recognized it if we were followed. I never went back and don't intend to. We did report it to the police, but never heard anything about it afterward. This story happened to my wife's sister 1 year ago. They are uber religious, and the state of her mental stability, on top of a finger found plus a police follow-up, makes this story 100% true and searchable. For the sake of privacy, I am changing names. I don't want whoever was involved to become aware. Last July, my sister-in-law, Jackie, was going to head back to Boise, Idaho, to visit for the weekend. Her husband lives in Provo and is going to law school there as he just graduated from a BYU chapter somewhere in southern Idaho. I'm not from Idaho and I'm not Mormon, so I don't remember where it's located, but Google it if you wish. Anyways, Jackie decided to drive from Provo, Utah and head up to BYU to say hello to her friends just before coming back to Boise. The route she was on was I-15, which forks off into I-84 up to Boise. After you pass through Salt Lake City, the route becomes lost in a plain rolling flat of miscellaneous desert dotted by farmland here and there. Jackie left Provo, Utah in the evening as she planned on making dinner for her husband before her departure. She ended up leaving around 11 p.m. and given the late time, she decided to forego visiting her friends at the BYU chapter and headed along I-84 to come straight to Boise. She was in between Tremonton, Utah and Burley, Idaho, in the literal middle of nowhere, when she drove up to what looked like a body lying in the road. The location is so desolate there are no radio channels, cell service, go figure, or lights to be seen for hours. This 24-year-old girl was in the middle of the desert, in a crappy green Dodge car that already had enough problems, so it's a miracle she made it home to us without issue to begin with. She arrived at my wife's parents' house, but that was just the beginning of the story, really. Here is her account of what led up to this event. At 2 a.m., she said she saw something lying on the road in the distance. As she came closer, she could see it was a body in the road, lifeless, in the middle of nowhere. It stretched across both lanes, and she could not simply pass without running it over. Cautiously, she came to a stop and made sure she parked about 15 yards away, and then stopped. She opened her door and yelled, "Are you all right?" But no response could be heard. With the car lights broadcasting brightly on the body in the road, she got out of her car and slowly walked towards the person. As she got about 10 feet from the body in the road, she could see it was a dummy, fully dressed in human clothes, just lying there. Terrified, she sprinted back to her car, slammed the door, and sped over the dummy. We received a cell phone call from her around Mountain Home, Idaho, about 45 minutes away from Boise. She was shaken and terribly scared, claiming she could hear footsteps chasing her to her car before she got in and drove off. We wrote it off as a freak accident as we were all asleep and it just sounded too bizarre to be anything of worry. As she pulled into the subdivision, she called us once again to help her unload the car and to probably console given the bizarre experience. I opened the garage door and stood in the driveway with my wife, waiting for her to pull in. She came racing into the driveway and jumped out of the car. This is where I freaking lost it. She opened the car door and a finger fell out. She had not stopped and drove straight to us after she came across a dummy. The person who had placed the dummy there had chased her back to her car, and as she had slammed the car door and sped off, the person had reached out, losing a finger in the slammed door. We immediately called the police in the area she said she stopped at. The cops did a survey of all hospitals in the area for a man with a missing finger, and they found an exact match of the description. He was still in the hospital when he was arrested. The police did not give any details as to the man's past or who he was. They just simply told us not to worry because he had been arrested. I'm sure it's an anticlimactic ending to a terrifying scenario, but I will never forget the feeling that came over me when that finger fell out of her car door. I'm terrible at telling stories, let alone real ones, so if you have any questions, please ask. I always drive with a firearm in my vehicle now anytime I travel. Hey guys, glad to see you made it to the end of the video. Have you ever had any strange encounters out in the desert? Make sure to let me know in the comments below. If you have any video requests or stories you'd like to hear read, be sure to reach out. Alright guys, that just about wraps up the video. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So long, Fear Seekers. I'll see you in the next video.